Welcome to this edition of Underground Strategy Podcast. My name is Max and I'm here with my co-host Tony. And tonight we are going to talk a bit about PMCs, private military companies, and what they are. But first, Tony, how are you doing today?
Thanks, Max. Good to be here with you and with our listeners. I've had a good day. Thank you so much. It's a Saturday. It's been really good. Weather not too bad. How about things on your end?
Things on my end has been excellent. You can see I feel outside. It's, fall is coming closer. Winter is coming, as they say in Game of Thrones, and I'm happy about that. So it's been a very productive week for me as well.
As you say, fall's coming, but for the rest of us in the Commonwealth, we think autumn's coming.
Yeah, I know.
I couldn't resist. I'm sorry.
You know how it is. It's like bonnet or hood. If we take that from the book, it's exactly the same thing. So yeah, it's weird, but you have learned to live with it, and I will try to improve it if I can. But I think it will stay like this.
And for our listeners, Max is talking about when we wrote the book 788, which is Max's memoir about the first part of his career. And then one of it would be, I would talk about the bonnet in writing something, and he would talk about the hood. So, just different inflections, but all basically the same thing.
Yeah.
Sorry to break your flow there, Max, but back over to you.
So we're going to talk about PMCs today, and I actually going to throw the question right back at you because you're very well versed in this, Tony. What is a PMC?
Thanks for that, Max. I'm going to start with the kind of simple answer that most of us will use just in regular conversation. And for me, a private military company is maybe a fancy word of saying a mercenary army made up of mercenaries. And some people may call them guns for hire or soldiers of fortune. And that's kind of how they are known. And they've been around for almost time immemorial. People say soldiering is one of the oldest professions. We'll wait for someone to write into us to tell us what the other older profession is. but and as long as soldiering was around and that other one that we won't mention, then certainly mercenaries have been around, and they've taken a number of different forms. They basically just come around and say, when a national army or in the past a kingdom needed additional forces, they would bring in those contractors or mercenaries. And it's got a long, sometimes proud and sometimes disreputable history. So that's really the high level of how I see PMCs, and they certainly have come into, they've come front and center over the last maybe 20, 30 years, just in terms of the modern context. Max, I'm not sure if you want to say anything to us about that. I know you've bought a couple of books from a certain famous leader that we'll maybe touch on, Ibn Ballo.
Of course, I have all of his books and even the special edition of his most famous book that I'm actually going to probably look up and cut in here later in post, so I don't have to be ashamed. Yes, this is my recording of shame, since I could not remember when recording that podcast the name of Ibn Ballo's most famous book, which is, of course, Executive Outcomes Against All Odds, which I highly recommend. And I also recommend his Composite Warfare about successful ground force operations in Africa. So there you go. Shame on me, and let's get back to it. But yeah, and you're correct. I mean, mercenaries has been around forever. We had them in Sweden. We have had them down in Europe, in Africa, since basically the dawn of man. But I think the PMCs that people are thinking about, or what most people are thinking about today, is the modern PMC and how they came to be. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, I would say around the 90s, the modern era of the PMC started, because during the Cold War, there was we had private security. Of course, there were some PMCs around, but there was not that much action really going on until the 90s when Ibn Ballo started his Executive Outcomes. And that, I would say, is the first modern legit PMC, because one has to differentiate a bit between the words. You can have a private security company, and you can also have a private military company, which have very different capacities. I mean, if you look at a private military company, they can have tanks, they can have fighter jets, helicopters, they can have platoon size, company size units that they deploy, while, for example, private security company, that can be 1-2 teams of contractors driving an armored car from example, from Baghdad airport to the green zone. They're working in related fields, but they're quite far away from each other.
Definitely a lot of overlap. But yeah, the scale is important, and you bring a good point about executive outcomes. And for all the nerds out there who's specializes in PMCs, I'm sure they'll give us a couple of different examples where PMCs were used by state governments maybe during the Cold War. But we'll take those points, Max. But I think you're right. Let's focus on those ones because it's pretty topical, and executive outcomes certainly had a big impact. I think you mentioned Ibn Barlow. Of course, he was famous in a lot of Southern Africa and the world. Very eloquent speaker, very charismatic, and a SADF commander, commanded in 3-2 Battalion. And then, of course, afterwards went into the security and intelligence services, and then founded his executive outcomes. I think for me, one of the missions that I can think of that stands out in my mind for executive outcomes, I mean, there were things in Angola, but then the Sierra Leone one, I think, was particularly striking for me, Max. At the time, there was a large failure of the peacekeeping mission, and they really, took action in the tactical sense and managed to restore order in a big way in Sierra Leone. And I think that besides what they'd done previously, they had a great, big name, but I think that really cemented their legacy. I'm not sure if you agree with that, and maybe if you can tell me a bit about how you think that links to Blackwater in the future. Maybe a different iteration of that type of executive outcomes type PMC.
Yeah, I think you used the correct word there, because they cemented their reputation and basically their legacy in the private military world. And I think we haven't really seen anything on that, or maybe on that scale, but I'm not sure. Maybe today with Wagner Group, but we haven't seen anything on that scale until maybe now. But I think to understand, when we are comparing, for example, executive outcomes and Blackwater, Aegis, all of those, we need to understand what is the difference between a regular traditional army and a PMC. And I can just take some key points. Of course, there are two different things because their motivation. One is a business enterprise. They work for money. And of course, they can be picky with their clients. They can choose what they think is ethical or not. But an army has political motives. Also, a PMC can be recruited to enforce political motives. But the core difference is that one is an army that is executing a country's political orders, while one is a business that you can actually hire. And I think that is something that's important to understand, especially when we bring Blackwater into the game.
That is a key difference, and I want to come back to that one, Max. I'm not sure if you want to go into Blackwater first, but I wanted to mention the Wagner Group and the African Corps specifically, and how they have some sort of selling point that they are there to defend dictatorships, especially if we look into West Africa at the moment. But before I go down that rabbit hole, do you think you maybe want to just close the loop on Blackwater? Because I think they've had I'm not sure how to put it, but there was definitely some controversial moments in Blackwater's history and some of the activities and things that happened in Iraq.
Definitely. And I'm just going to go back in the history, or at least for myself, and I'm going to start with myself, because when I was doing my basic military training, you could see there was an increase in recruiting for Iraq and Afghanistan from the private military companies, and one of them were Blackwater. And Sweden was targeted quite a lot because quality military officers that had basically nothing to do. And I know a lot of people are going to say that it wasn't like that, but the Swedish armed forces were downsizing, people were fired, and they offered an option that paid 3, 4, 5, 6 times the monthly pay in the Swedish army. So it started there, and then we have the increasing and very dynamic conflict in Iraq primarily to start with, which basically became a free market because it was a hybrid war. It was hard to control. The Allied governments were taking quite heavy losses. They want to spread that out on different units, of course, which is quite common with the PMCs because they don't have to count them as their own casualties. And then it was also a business. It was like a marketplace for business because there was the shortage of troops, the shortage of security, the amount of entrepreneurs and foreign businesses that were setting up to build infrastructure, to build roads, to build the telephone networks, data, water, hospitals. All of that was booming. And there was a lot of money to dig in Iraq specifically. And then, of course, the Americans, they have had plenty of different companies down in Iraq. But one of the more famous or infamous ones were Blackwater. They are now called, they have changed names, I think 3 times, but they're now called Academy. So they wanted to do a bit of whitewashing. But for example, Blackwater was involved in the Nisour Square massacre in Iraq in 2007, I think it was, which, I mean, it made international headlines. We have foreign contractors, non-combatants, non-soldiers that are working on a quite loose DoD kind of contract or a Ministry of Defense if they were under the UK, in the UK sector, which basically mandated, the mandates were loose. There was no legislation. This was the first time, at least on this scale, and with this many players involved, that we legally tried the PMC's role, what it meant, and what legal consequences it had. And at this point, we had Blackwater operators opening up towards civilians, and there was mass casualties, and it was hard to prove. It's always hard to prove who did what, and were they actually mandated? Could he use weapons for self-defense? Could he use them offensively? Could he use them on, all of those questions? So it was quite an inferno, to say the least.
I think there was certainly some controversy there. And I think with PMCs, the same way as with national armies, depending on if you're going to a war-torn state or in a failed state or something like that, or even developed states, there can be atrocities committed. And yeah, I think that's what was one of the critiques. I think a good couple of years back when Kofi Annan was the Secretary General of the UN, and we have to keep in mind that he had, not only been the first staffer of the UN that became, or the only staffer that became, in fact, the SG, but he had headed up the Department of Peacekeeping during the genocide in Rwanda and during the failures in Srebrenica and also in Somalia. And that might be a bit harsh, but he was certainly involved. But he turned out to be quite good at his job, and he was. But they were understanding how the use of force would work in these things. And he was an activist he advocated for a strong use of force, and he did that in the Balkans, to stop a genocide or to end a war. So he was a very practical man. But even he said, and he made the declaration when there was an argument for PMCs being used to stop genocide or for the UN to use them, he made the call, said, nah, it's too much of a blurry line to use a PMC. And I think that's where the matter was settled. I mean, there's maybe a previous discussion before him about a UN army. But yeah, I think that national accountability kind of gives a bit more credibility to a military force. I'm sure you must agree, Max.
Time for a tactical reload. If you're enjoying this, leave a review on your platform. YouTube crew, hit subscribe to support the mission. Let's roll. I do agree, and I think that is one of the biggest issues that the PMCs have. There's no doubt that they are effective and that they can solve their missions, but when you don't have a backing of a nation itself or a country, and you don't have, you don't know who they recruit, because it's up to the company who they recruit and put on the ground. And it's not always clear if they have received the right training, if they have the right moral compass, all of that. Because and I'm not going to say too much. I worked in this world myself, but there is a certain type of people that are drawn to these kind of jobs. And I'm not saying all of them. Definitely not. There's a lot of good guys. There's a lot of guys that has a very, very sturdy moral compass. but there are also a certain type that kind of enjoys this lifestyle, and that's a more dangerous. That's a harder type to control, and definitely harder to get them to live after the rules of war that are generally accepted.
No, definitely. No, I think that type of adventurism. Yeah, I think most people have seen it. I've seen it, and I want to loop back to this point about the credibility and the control that you're mentioning that a nation state has. And I like the way you've explained it in the Swedish context, because I think for myself and for many of the listeners, we aren't fully up to date always what happens, in that part of the world. But I want to loop back, if we can, Max, to what we were saying about the idea of a state-sponsored PMC. And of course, from what you were saying earlier, PMCs get hired by a state to execute their national objectives, you were mentioning. And when we tie that to ideology, it might be a bit tricky. I want to bring on two examples. The one is the Dake Advisory Group, a South African-based mercenary group. Unfortunately, when I was working in many parts of Africa, there's a bit of a reputation at this point for South Africans. So whenever they hear a South African accent, and you're not in South Africa, people are like, yeah. So are you with a security company? But yeah, so I want to talk about just briefly the Dake Advisory Group. But first, I want to just touch on Wagner. And because it's something like a private military company plus. And I only have the publicly available reports and from what I hear from people. But they seem to be funded by the Russian state. And they have a feeder from the armed forces and perhaps other elements of society that goes into the Wagner Group. Is that also your take on it, Max?
It is my take, and I'm just going to mention so we're clear that, of course, there are many state-sponsored defense corporations and PMCs. You have DynCorp that has contracts a lot to the American states, for example, KBR and Root, Aegis. You had former Blackwater, all of those that are actually hired by different states. So it's not uncommon, but Wagner Group is slightly different because it's a PMC plus. And they're also trying to hide it even better, or they don't want the affiliation, but they also want the propaganda affiliation. But yes, it's definitely because they have a funnel from the armed forces. It's more direct, and I think it's more thought out than, for example, of course, there's a lot of veterans, American veterans working for DynCorp, for example, or KBR and Root. But it's not like a direct line like that. It's not like they're just putting their own money on the line there. So yeah, it's a different game.
Yeah, that's interesting, and I want to be fair on this point, because I think in the mid-2000s the American or the US changed some of their laws to allow for security contractors to be involved in active operations. So in some ways they also facilitated it. Like you said, it's not as direct and as smooth perhaps as in the Russian case, but I want to be fair that all big powers and states, and I think you mentioned it earlier, Max, have this need to bolster forces in the field.
Yes, they do. And they also have the need to conduct operations. And I'm not saying now that everybody does it, but that to conduct operations that they might not want to stand behind if they fail, for example. So there's a lot of different motives for a state definitely to hire private security companies.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I think so. And you mentioned some of Blackwater's controversy. I mean, Wagner, I think, have committed tremendous acts of, violence, and there's been also several there's been murders and so from what we hear, and human rights abuses, whether the Central African Republic, Mali, or other areas. Of course, some of them still need to be worked through, but I believe there are independent reports saying that. I wanted to mention one last thing while I'm on about the Dake Advisory Group, a smaller PMC. And they operated in Mozambique and the insurgency, I think, is still active, but not anywhere where it was maybe 3-4 years ago, as far as I know. And the SADC group now being active there. So with them, I found it interesting. They doing some good operations, and they were involved also in the rescue when the hotel was under siege. There's maybe some revisionist pieces happening now, saying, okay, was there or wasn't there people trapped in that hotel, and what were the intentions? Anyway, we'll let that history come out with time. But once again, you had mentioned the context of PMCs. And this one, the PMC being South African and maybe supported by former SADF soldiers, there was a claim of racism that they went to the hotel and first saved all the white people and then took different racial or ethnic groups after that. Whether that's true or not, I don't know. No, there was an Amnesty report saying that, which is normally quite a credible source, but I would like to hear different views on that. But just how, the local and cultural background of each PMC plays a part in different conflict, Max.
Yes. And I agree with you. And that was also a very interesting example how people interpret the actions and how easy, especially when something is done by a PMC, how easily it can be tweaked or distorted, or it can become misinformation or used for propaganda. I have two more points, if that is okay. They're going to be quite short, but I wanted to just mention my own experiences, how it is to work with the PMC, and then I will have a question for you at the end.
My God, I don't know why you didn't bring that up sooner, Max. I mean, that's the main thing.
It is not the main thing, but it's. I have had, after my army days, I have had, and of course, I have had a lot of contact. I've been working a lot alongside PMCs. I have been working in a PMC, and I can say sometimes it works great. It depends a bit on how they are recruited, because you can have operators coming, straight from the CIA, but they just want to work under a different brand for a while. But you have most of the time, what happens on the ground, especially in Afghanistan and Iraq, is that you put a Westerner, usually as a team leader, or a South African, quite common. And you fill it up then with people from not so rich countries. And that usually creates a mix. And some of the guys that I've met over the years has been the most hardest working soldiers I ever met, with a very straight moral compass. But their motivation is money. And that is not a good base to stand on when you're going to conduct military operations, because then you are taking enormous amounts of risk, but only for monetary gain. And I can see if you come from poverty, that it might be your only way out. But it's also very sad that it has to be like that. But usually a good part of working in a PMC is that you get to work with so many different nationalities, and you can really see what they have to offer. I've been working, and I'm going to mention them side by side, because I've been working with both in the same team: Ukrainians, Russians, Nepalese, South Africans, Indonesians, a lot of Eastern Europeans in general, Lithuania, Latvia, Poland, Bulgaria, these kind of nations. And they get a lot of shit, usually, when they're in their armies, in the regular armies. Everybody's always going to hack down on a Bulgarian or Polish soldier, maybe, or a Romanian soldier. But they're actually well-trained often, and they're a lot of fun to work with, and they're really, really good.
That's amazing. Yeah, I mean, and just to be clear, I know you're not praising any kind of PMC. You're just giving your experience there, Max, and it's really valuable, because beneath it all, you spoke to the motivations, and it's just people, right? At the core of it, we want to put some food on the table for the family. And I think that's common across a number of different jobs and professions. I suppose it's just a few bad apples sometimes that gives it a bad name. You mentioned a question for me.
Yes, I have a question for you. And that is, if you look into the future, do you think PMCs are they growing, or is it going to be decline, or is there a bright future ahead for them? Or at least in their usage?
Yeah, I think it's for the way I see it, it's forever. And some historians will keep me right here. But even at the Battle of Thermopylae, the Spartans in the movie 300, there were 300 Spartans, but there were, I believe, thousands of other Greek mercenaries that were also on that same battlefield or on that mountain pass. So, and I don't mean only on the Persian side, I mean also on the Greek side or on the Spartan side.
Yeah.
And that's now going back over 2,500 years. So if you look how we've gone since then, and there's been mercenaries throughout Napoleonic times, Middle Ages, current, and I see it on the same trajectory, Max. I see us, because the need hasn't disappeared and as in capitalism, you can't really create a need. Maybe you can bolster it or you can create some sort of marketing around it, but there's a need for governments and political players, and I think it's going to grow, if anything.
Yeah, I'm on the same. I mean, there will always be a need, as you said, for enforcement, and because this is what it is, it's enforcements in different types. And I think if I'm going to take a guess, we're going to see more private military companies. Even now, private security companies has exploded everywhere again, and we're going to see private police forces around the world more and more. So I think it's going to be, outsourcing. It's a business model, and I think it's going to grow. I mean, we outsource everything today. So soon enough, we're going to outsource and we are already, police forces and all of that. But I think we're going to see a significant growth over the years.
100%. What an interesting chat today, Max. And we'll leave a couple of links in the show notes, as we always do. Just a couple of the PMCs. We welcome some feedback from all our listeners. We're keen to hear your thoughts on the subject. We know it is divisive. We do touch on a couple of divisive topics, but we do it respectfully, and we welcome your thoughts and your feedback. As always, last words to you, Max.
It was a great chat, Tony. I think I have a feeling that we will speak much, much more about PMCs in the future because it's an ingrained part of today's battlefield and in all modern conflict, basically. But I'm looking forward to the next episode. I know we have some good stuff coming up, as always. And you can find us on all social media. Twitter, we have UG Strat is our Twitter now. On all of the rest, we are Underground Strategy, and we have undergroundstrategy.com. So I hope to see you next week, and goodbye.
Bye-bye.